Thank you, Kelly, for the introduction, and hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining this next session. For those of you who have just joined and missed my earlier introduction, I'm Tim Sadler, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Tessian, and I'll be your host for this session. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Principal Analyst in Information Security at 451 Research, Garrett Bekker. Garrett has viewed enterprise security from a variety of vantage points over the past 16 years, including holding various analyst and research roles. He focuses on all things data security, which makes him well positioned to speak to us today about the impact distributed workforces and flexible working has had on information security, and specifically what we can do to minimize the risk of data loss. And again, as a quick reminder, you can submit questions for us through the Q&A widget at the side of the screen, and we'll get to those later on. So to kick off, at Tessian, we know people make mistakes, they break the rules, or they can be easily hacked. And our research shows that these behaviors are all more likely to happen when people are working remote. Garrett, what key strategies should IT leaders be aware of to address this heightened risk?
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and thanks everyone for joining us. I think a couple of things. The way we've been looking at the whole work from home thing is really looking at it in a matter of phases. And again, I think the very first phase is really about just survival, right? Just get everyone connected, get them up and running. A lot of firms that we've looked at have gone from anywhere from 5, 10, 15, 20% of their employees working remotely to over 95% in a matter of days, if not weeks. So for a lot of those firms, it's just a matter of getting them hooked up on their VPNs if they're using that for remote access or virtual desktop infrastructure, or even some of the newer zero trust based things. That also typically required, in many cases, just simple stuff like issuing laptops for people who didn't have them. So the first phase, I think, was all about just getting up and running. And I also think that meant that some of the security steps were very basic up front. And I think now we've basically moved into phase two, and that's where all that initial infrastructure is in place. And now firms, I think, have a better chance of thinking about, okay, what are some of the risks that we have to be worried about? I think, as your data pointed out, I think was pretty stunning in a sense that there's a huge disconnect between what employers think their people are doing and what people are actually doing and what they think they can get away with. And I think it's important to distinguish between this can be both malicious and non-malicious, right? It can be as simple as users trying to do things either because they're lazy or they're just under the gun. They're just trying to get their jobs done as best they can. So they're doing things like taking corporate documents and emailing it to their Gmail account or their Yahoo Mail account and what have you. Or they're saving things in Box and Dropbox. Now, that may not be a problem. It may be a problem. But traditionally, those are things that standard DLP tools may find difficult to discover. But certainly, I think that's a risk that I think most firms have to deal with. I think some of the other issues we have to worry about is, as I said before, phishing. From what I can see, at least anecdotally, we've seen a massive increase in phishing related directly to COVID-19. That's a huge issue. It's also introducing the potential for ransomware. Ransomware is a really big problem right now. So again, to the extent that your employees are doing things like potentially not backing up their machines, you can run into some real serious problems.
Thanks for that, Garrett. And the research that you mentioned, so the DLP research Tessian conducted recently found that 48% of employees say they're less likely to follow safe data practices from working from home. Is there a place for automation and machine learning to help businesses review and investigate around the clock?
Yeah, I think so. And again, that data to me is just striking. And I think it really shows the big divide we're at in terms of, IT's perception of what their users are doing on the one hand, and then looking at what they're actually doing and how the way they think they can get away with things that they can't in the office, I find is very interesting. I think, sending data to unauthorized accounts is obviously a common problem. people are potentially sending sensitive documents. For example, it might be as simple as, hey, I want to use it on a different machine that maybe has a bigger screen, or I like the keyboard better. And again, they're all trying to think of ways to get their jobs done. It reminds me a little bit of a problem when I first started at 451 6.5 years ago, the whole shadow IT problem, right? And that gave spawn to this whole industry in cloud security known as CASB, or Cloud Access Security Broker. And what the essential problem there was that people were um, downloading unsanctioned applications, signing up for applications without IT's control. And in some cases, that wasn't a problem, but really it introduced a new element of risk that IT wasn't prepared to deal with. And to some extent, with email, we're seeing the same thing. It may be the users don't have any bad intent, and it may be they're just looking for a way to get their job done. But it becomes a real problem in terms of security. Um, and I think this is an area where traditional DLP tools have really fallen short, right? The typical things based on either regular expression searches or pattern matching, things like that. Those are typically good for catching social security numbers, credit cards, things that might be flagged for some sort of a compliance violation, whether it be GDPR or HIPAA. But I think more subtle things, again, like saving data up to Box or Dropbox, or emailing things to a personal account, all those things that we're likely to see increasingly in a work from home scenario. I think traditional DLP has not been great at finding. Um, and I think that's really an area where things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, even to some extent, I've seen new technologies like natural language processing, natural language understanding, really help uncover behavior that's been difficult to capture before. Things that that are very subtle and have a certain nuance that really requires building, I'd say, a lot of context around to determine what's normal and quote unquote what's normal and what's not normal.
Yeah, yeah, you preempted one of my next questions actually there, Garrett. So
Sorry,
the
but
other thing that our research, the other thing that our research revealed was that data loss incidents on email are happening as much as 38 times more often than IT leaders currently estimate. How important is it to have the right insight into threats and user trends to actually close this alarming disconnect? And this is something I know you've just spoken about as well, but how do we actually get to that promised land where IT and the employees are both in sync with one another?
yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think, again, it goes back to this is I think it's not an easy problem to solve without some sort of context for what normal and what abnormal or unusual behavior is. Again, that traditional pattern matching can't find. A single action can be interpreted multiple ways. It may be fairly benign. It may be something that's, again, somebody wants to use a different device. It may be a legitimate user with a legitimate purpose, but it may also involve data that may be sensitive. So that in itself may potentially create a problem if that data were to be exposed. In an extreme case, it could be a disgruntled employee looking to cause damage. It could be one of your top salespeople about to go to a competitor and look to take all their client lists and things like that with them. So I think to be able to distinguish between these is a real problem in an area where traditional DLP tools, I think, have historically struggled. I think the other thing to keep in mind too is the data that we see repeatedly is that, in fact, our own internal data, we've got a service called the Voice of the Enterprise where we survey enterprise end users, and repeatedly we pop up that email is still probably the number one threat vector of all, and that's despite we've got all new things like all the new communication and collaboration platforms that are out there. It's still good old email that causes a lot of our problems because it's still widely in use, and certainly an easy way to attack folks. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good point. And that's exactly how we think about it. The fact that email is default open by nature makes it such a security risk, certainly from a phishing and impersonation attack standpoint. And I know that this is a topic that's close to your heart as well. You talk, and we've previously spoken about the importance of how effective UAT or user acceptance testing is for helping with phishing and email risks.
Yeah, I think
Sorry, I guess I didn't maybe point that correctly as a question, Garrett. But I guess what are your thoughts around UAT, or like, could you share some more thoughts on why you think UAT is or isn't so effective in that?
yeah, I think a little bit. I don't know, maybe mixed view of it. I think it can be a valuable tool in the right context, right? I think there's certainly no harm in educating your employees about certain things they shouldn't do. That's never a bad thing, right? And I think even as security professionals, we could stand reminders from time to time on the things we shouldn't do. I think there are a couple of drawbacks, however, and I think my ultimate view is that user awareness training is fine, but it's not. It's maybe arguably you could say in a mathematical terms it's necessary, but not sufficient. And I think it needs to be used in conjunction with other tools. One of the problems I think overall with security is that in a lot of ways end users really don't face any consequences, right? They're not accountable for a lot of issues. So if they do something wrong, um, they're not necessarily reprimanded for it, which I think is a whole other set of questions. But I also think phishing attacks have become so effective and so targeted and so really almost impossible to distinguish. You can really catch anyone, and I think it becomes that point where no amount of awareness training in the world is really going to help. It's really unrealistic to think that certain of these attacks, some of the ones I've seen recently, are just really, really hard for to put the burden on end users to do that.
Mm,
I also think, me personally, I'm very aware of the limitations of putting a huge burden on your end users for a lot of your security posture. And again, it ties back in some degree to the accountability issue. But I also think it's a little bit unrealistic. But I also think it puts a big burden on your end users. And what I've found is they don't like it, and if people don't like it, they're going to do whatever they can to get around it, and they're going to click on anything or classify anything in whatever they have to do to get that email out the door and make the tool go away and allow them to do their job. So those are some of the issues that I see. Again, to be clear, I think there is value, to doing user awareness training, but I also think um, it's got its limitations, and I think it best used as a complement with other solutions.
yeah, no, I think that makes complete sense, and I share that view as well. It's very, very difficult, certainly when you're in that game of trying to train people for potentially infinite scenarios that could play out with regard to impersonation. But it is still, nonetheless, awareness training is important, and it's an important part of a security strategy. Switching gears slightly, remote work has accelerated a trend that was, some will say on its way anyway. Where are we going next? What do you think is on the agenda for IT leaders after this?
Yeah, again, great question, and one that we're basically living with day to day. Again, we've been looking at phases. Phase one was about getting everyone up and running and just getting everything working. And then phase two is, I think, about, okay, now how do we go think about securing this environment? And I think where we're also getting into right now is, okay, where do we go from here? We've already seen, at least here in the United States, depending on where you live, um, schools are starting to think about reopening. Certain businesses that we're aware of are starting to lay down their plans about returning to the office, what that could look like, et cetera. Certainly, that'll have implications for the office environment, and in turn, how security is done. Um, but I also think it's very interesting what is the permanence of the whole work from home thing. So our pre-COVID data showed that roughly just over one quarter of all all enterprises had employees worked from home at least some or part of their week. Now we've seen a big increase in that, obviously. But what I think was most interesting, our most recent published survey on this, we asked what are the common ways to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, and obviously, I think the number one reason was restricting travel and no longer going to meetings, and number three was work from home. But interestingly, 38% of respondents said that they thought work from home strategies are actually going to be permanent. Um, Now, you may have heard there's been firms in the news that, such as Facebook, have talked about making work from home permanent. Others have said they plan to extend it for the rest of the year. We did a more recent survey, and I'm not allowed to release the details yet because it hasn't been published, but I can say that that number of firms who see work from home as being permanent is actually increased quite sharply above 38%. So I think that is certainly something that's going to happen. And with that, I think we're going to see an acceleration of other trends. I think we could see a boost for more cloud migration. We could see, I think, more widespread adoption of SaaS applications and accelerating what we'd potentially previously been in place. I also think we're going to see an increase in this whole zero trust phenomenon that has gotten traction in the past year or so, which basically the essential idea is it does away with the old security paradigm, which is based on this notion of a hardened perimeter and everyone on the inside is trusted and everyone on the outside is untrusted. That has been eroded considerably with the rise of mobility and cloud computing and the fact that workers are no longer at home, they're traveling, what have you. I think work from home just accelerates that and moves us more towards that zero trust phenomenon. Um, and again, what are all the security implications that entails along with it? I think it'll see that leads to increased adoption of multi-factor authentication, access control strategies, and on the data side, I think you're going to see a lot more use of encryption. You'll see a lot more use of data security in general to make sure not only your users but also your data is locked down in those environments. Because as your data has pointed out, um, there's less control on the perimeter than there used to be, and at the endpoint. So we need to take a lot more steps to do that, and that includes DLP, that includes potentially data discovery, that includes protection against phishing and anti-malware, et cetera. So.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. We're now going to move to some questions from our audience. So I'm just picking up one here. It sounds like there's a bigger role for the DLP at the moment. Are boards viewing security priorities or spending in security differently because of the pandemic?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, the short answer is yes, and I think it's because they have to. I don't think they've got really much choice in the matter. Again, going back to the early question, I think a lot of firms went through the fire drill of setting up work from home and dropping everything they were doing. I heard anecdotally talking to some CISOs that any project that required intensive resources or any planning and long-term commitments was sort of kicked to the side while work from home was put in place. And I think potentially now that, again, that's up and running, some of those, it may be some time to come back to some of those projects. One example would be, something like privilege account management. Some IAM projects tend to be, fairly resource intensive. I also think this could give a boost to security offerings that are not heavy touch or require a lot of resources, things that may be cloud-based, things that may be API-based that have a fairly quick time to deployment. I think could get a boost in this requirement. But I also think we're also seeing too is firms are, not surprisingly, overall security firms are increasing their spending plans on security pretty steadily. Um, we had done a couple of, I guess you'd call them flash surveys throughout the COVID pandemic, and we've seen pretty consistently the expectations for security spending overall to rise. Now, I think that could potentially accelerate But we're also, as I mentioned earlier, let me step back a bit. I think the one difference there and one challenge is that it may not necessarily be the same for all firms, right? While some firms may be able to increase their spending, I think it's reasonable to presume that that will depend to some extent on what industry vertical you're in. Obviously, in some areas of IT have fared reasonably well throughout this, for example, but if you're potentially in travel and leisure or hotels and lodging or energy, certain other sectors of our economy haven't fared so well. But I also think, again, getting back to this idea that we may see more digital transformation initiatives and these plans for cloud migration increase going forward. I think that's also going to put some more emphasis on securing data overall. In fact, our survey data has shown consistently over the last several years that the number one pain point and the number one priority for most of the CISOs and enterprises that we talk to by far is cloud security. And even within that, when we look, some of the questions we ask around cloud security points to DLP as being a top use case. So I think those are definitely some things to ponder as we go forward in this environment.
That's great. Thank you, Garrett. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but thank you to all of those who submitted questions. For those that we didn't manage to cover, we'll be sure to follow up with you individually to continue the conversation. I want to say a huge thank you to Garrett for joining us today and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us in this space. And thank you to our audience for joining in this session. I'll be handing back over to Kelly, so please stay tuned.